the kinds of challenges that one may experience. Admittedly, and I'll give a little bit of I'll preempt some of the questions that we're going to ask. Rabbi Melanchik sometimes tends to be a little bit more on the stringent side. And so when we talk about airplane travel, I'm going to be pulling out some of the article that came out from the OU about about appropriate conduct that perhaps lightens the load somewhat. But we'll get there. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Now, one of the things that we've been speaking about is our circumstances or situations that are rabbinically prohibited. So you might recall some of these interesting situations. One of these interesting situations that might be only rabbinically prohibited is if, for example, you as a Kohen are behind closed doors and you're in the social hall, and the deceased is in the sanctuary where a service for the deceased is taking place. But it turns out that for one reason or another, the hearse can only pull up next to the social hall, and the deceased is going to be taken out through the social hall. So you might think, okay, well, I'm a Kohen, therefore I can keep all the doors closed and I can leave the room before the deceased comes through. But if you recall, we said that closed doors are not considered to be a boundary or a barrier to the location where we know the deceased is going to be transported. So even though normally we say that yes, doors and walls do interrupt, they do stop, they do block the transmission of impurity. When we talk specifically about the impurity that's generated where you share a roof or you share a shelter, you're in the same sort of binyan, you're in the same structure. Normally we say those boundaries, those barriers are effective, except when the situation where the mace is to be taken out through the location where you happen to be, then the boundary, those doors are not considered to be effective. That's a rabbinic ruling according to most authorities. We're going to see that when it comes to a mitzvah obligation scenario, those rabbinic prohibitions are considered moot. We do not worry about the rabbinic considerations. We say that a Kohen is allowed to transgress those rabbinic requirements or rabbinic gezeros, as they're called, in order to facilitate the performance of a mitzvah. What was another example we said of a rabbinic prohibition? Not standing within 4 amos of the deceased. Right? In general, we said that a Kohen should stay 4 amos away from the deceased, whether it's a grave, whether it's an actual body. A Kohen should stay 4 amos away, 4 paces away. It's about 8 feet or so. When it comes to the performance of a mitzvah, a Kohen is allowed to get up close. When we're obviously not talking about a scenario or a situation where a Kohen is supposed to come in contact with the deceased. Like very often we talk about the case of the mace mitzvah, where the person who's passed away who has nobody to take care of them. Obviously, a Kohen is allowed to directly interface. You're allowed to directly touch and to move and to do what you need to do in order to ensure that the mace is properly taken care of. But we're not talking in that scenario. We're talking about in a case where you need to walk by the body in order to be able to perform a mitzvah. And we'll talk perhaps about what exactly those mitzvahs might be. Another example, whatever, we'll see. He cites some examples as well.
Rabbi, quickly,
Yes,
if the deceased is a family of the Kohanim, all these restrictions are still in
that's
place.
correct. Yes, correct. Yes, absolutely. All right. In certain mitzvah situations, we're on page 52 for those of you who are looking in. In certain mitzvah situations, a Kohen can become tameh to a tuma derabbanan. These are rabbinic forms of impurity. Now he brings Eretz Amim. We're not going to talk too much about that. We spoke about it last week. Another one is the Beis HaPras. Remember what a Beis HaPras is? The Beis HaPras is a field in which somebody's grandfather was buried, and we don't remember where the grave is. Or alternatively, it's and more to the point, then the industrial farm buys the land and plows it all up. We said that a Kohen should not, within about 100 amos area, should not enter into the cemetery. That's considered to be a rabbinic prohibition. A Kohen is allowed to enter into that parcel of land if it's to perform a mitzvah, as we're going to clarify. The Gemara says that a Kohen can enter a Beis HaPras in order to learn Torah. That's example number one. For example, you have to walk through this parcel land in order to get to your class. Uh, some scenario, some situation like that, or to find a wife. The Tosfos say that this dispensation was only for the aforementioned mitzvos that are very important. So Tosfos says, when you take a look at the Talmud, the only dispensation that we have are for these specific mitzvos. Therefore, only for these mitzvos can we allow for the individual, the Kohen, to come in contact with with these sources of impurity that are of rabbinic origin. However, the She'iltos say that the mitzvos mentioned are lighter mitzvos, and that a Kohen may become tameh, may become impure to a Tumah D'Rabbanan for other mitzvos as well. So who was the She'iltos? Rav She'iltos was Rav Acha. I'm drawing a blank on his father's name, but he was one of the Gaonim. It's actually one of the first rabbinic writings post the Talmud. He was one of the Gaonim, one of the heads of one of the academies in Bavel in Babylon, and he wrote a almost like a it's not exactly a commentary to the Torah, but he addressed philosophical and halachic issues on the particular parsha of the week. And he called it the She'iltos, which literally means the questions, because he would always start with a question that he would address and that he would answer. It's a very scholarly work. It's not studied a ton. There are some interesting commentaries on it, but the She'iltos is a very important source of halachic rulings. And one of the halachic rulings that he gives is that it matters not the mitzvah. A kohen, in order to perform a mitzvah, is allowed to transgress some of these rabbinic edicts, these rabbinic sources of impurity, in order to be able to facilitate performing that mitzvah. And he concludes the halacha follows the opinion of the she'iltos. You are allowed, he says, to come in contact with to become tummy, or to become tummy for a rabbinic impurity in order to be able to perform mitzvahs. This dispensation also applies for one to facilitate another to perform a mitzvah. So even if the Kohen himself is not going to be the one to do the mitzvah, but rather he's needed so that a mitzvah can be done, that's also permitted. He doesn't have to be the primary actor. He can be a more passive participant. He can be the facilitator. That's enough to allow him to come in contact with these sources of rabbinic impurity. This dispensation only applies if there's only one path that one could take to perform the mitzvah. Again, if you have a plan B, if you have a option to walk a different path, to take you through a different location that would not present itself as a problem, then yes, a Kohen would be obligated to take that plan B, to take perhaps even a longer path, not excessively long, obviously, but the Kohen, it does, if there is another option, the Kohen should take that second option. But should there not be another option, then we say the Kohen is allowed to come in contact in these ways with these sources of rabbinic impurity in order to perform a mitzvah. All right. Now, a doubtful tuma. This is an unusual case. The Mishnah says that a safek tuma b'reshus harabim tahor. What exactly does that mean? So let's imagine that I am a man. I'm walking down the path, and I have two paths. Now, I did just learn this recently. I'm a bit of a nerd, and I do watch and I do sort of read about things that are perhaps obscure and useless pieces of information. But there was a time in English history when if someone was executed, they would be buried not in a cemetery, but by a fork in a road, or by an intersection underneath. This is a medieval custom that sort of extended even into the 16th, 17th century in the more rural areas of the United Kingdom. So on a crossroads, an intersection of two paths, there is a possibility that there is a body buried underneath there from hundreds of years ago. So as far as the Kohen is concerned, probably do not have to be too worried about it, because the body is probably completely decomposing. There's nothing left of it. But let's imagine, though, that this was taking place in a more recent time, and there are two paths that I could have taken to get me to town. Path A has a body, path B does not have a body. And I do not know which path I took. I took the one with the body, or if I took the one without the body. And I'm holding truma in my hand. Truma is a kind of item that should it become tameh, should it become in contact with the dead, I'd have to destroy it. The halacha is that if I don't know, this is called a safek tuma. I don't know which of the two paths I took. I just don't remember. And this is a public thoroughfare. It's open to everyone. We're going to qualify that in just a moment. In the case of a doubt in a Rishus Harabim, we take the lenient opinion. We rule leniently, and the truma is not considered to be impure. That's called a safek tuma b'rishus harabim. A safek tuma b'rishus harabim. It is tahor. A doubtful or uncertain impurity in a public thoroughfare. We say the item retains its purity. We decide leniently. That has impact as far as Kohanic is concerned as well. We'll get to that in a moment. The Meforshim explain that if there is a doubt concerning whether an item, or I'm sorry, for those of you at home, let me get the page for you. Right. Okay. The Mishnah says that Safek Tuma B'Rishus Harabim Tahor, a doubt of tuma, a doubt of impurity in a public thoroughfare in a Rishus Harabim is tahor. We view this as being pure. The Mefarshim explain if there is a doubt concerning whether an item became tameh or not, if the doubt occurred in a Rishus Harabim, which is a public thoroughfare, the item is considered to retain its purity. The converse is also true. Safek tuma b'rishus hayachid, in a private domain. So in my own property, for example, and there are two paths and there's a body buried underneath one of the two paths, and I don't know which one I took. If there's a doubt concerning impurity in a private domain, the item is considered to be tameh. The definition of a Rishus Harabim, or a public thoroughfare, and a Rishus Hayachid, a private thoroughfare, regarding this rule is not the same as for Shabbos. Does anybody offhand know how we define a public thoroughfare on Shabbos? It has to be six. I think it has to be 16 amos wide. It's a public thoroughfare that has to be 16 amos wide, and it cannot have a roof. Has to be open from both ends, meaning it can't be walled off. There can't be gates, and at least according to some authorities, there has to have traffic of 600,000 people in order for something to be considered on Shabbos to be a public domain. If something is considered to be a public domain, you cannot build an eruv. No streets in Calgary have traffic of 600,000 people. Perhaps maybe Highway 2, maybe, but it's unlikely. As such, that's why you can build an eruv within the city of Calgary. Once you get, because that's the number of people who lived in the encampment in the desert. That's how we derive the rules of a public thoroughfare by the encampment in the desert.
So does that mean that if it doesn't meet the definition of a public thoroughfare, it's a Reshut HaYachid?
It's not a Reshut HaYachid. A Reshut HaYachid requires actual walls and boundaries around it. It's what we call a carmelis, which can be rectified to be turned into a Reshut HaYachid, which is what the boundaries that we put up are all about.
To be continued.
Indeed.
That's not our topic.
No, but when it comes to at least impurity and impurity, the rules are different. Any area that three people have public access to is considered to be a Rishus Harabim, a public domain. The application of this rule is if there are two items in a Rishus Harabim, one tameh and one tahor, and he's unsure which one he touched, he remains tahor. That's generally the rule that I gave about walking down the path, and one path has a body as opposed to another. According to Tosfos, this rule is only in application where the tuma is clear and defined, and the doubt involves possible contact. That's the case that I gave, where I took one of two paths. I just don't know which path I took. Was it the one that put me in contact with the source of impurity, or the one that does not provide contact with the source of impurity? But it does not, we do not use suffix tuma b'rishus harabim to declare an area tahor based on this principle. You cannot use this to say that the public thoroughfare is considered tahor. You can only use this to indicate to you that I am an individual who possibly came in contact with something that is tameh. If it took place in a rishus harabim, then I am tahor myself. Many, however, apply this principle even regarding the status of a specific area. Now, that is where and how it affects a Kohen. If you say suffix tuma b'rishus harabim is also a ruling for the area itself, that will allow a Kohen to gain access to the property. We don't say you must stay away. If, however, if you're stringent like Tosfos, you cannot give that quality to the property. You cannot say, I don't know if there's a source of impurity here or not, and therefore it should be tahor. Tosfos says you can't do that. Tosfos says, if you don't know if there's a source of impurity, therefore, because it's a public thoroughfare, therefore we have to view it as being tahor. Tosfos says we can't do that, but most halachic authorities disagree with Tosfos. So that would mean, again, in our situation where there's a body in a public thoroughfare and I don't know where it is, I don't know it's there, according to most halachic authorities, a Kohen is allowed to traverse that location, that area, and not be concerned, because we would say this is a doubtful source of impurity in a public thoroughfare, therefore we consider it to be pure. We don't worry about it. We rule leniently. We rule on the side that says that purity is maintained. A Kohen is allowed to walk through that area.
Would that be a reason why Kohanic could or could not go to areas of the Holocaust, like concentration camps, where there may be bodies under the ground, unmarked?
Possibly. I don't know all the ins and outs of going there, but I would actually suspect that the Nazis were pretty good about destroying bodies.
Okay.
So I probably would say it may not even be a doubt in most cases, but I'm not certain, to be honest.
Okay.
I don't know what the halachic rulings are with regards to going to concentration camps. Jeff, question.
Somebody at a funeral today from Israel asked, do we have, she said that there is parts in cemeteries in Israel that is a path only for Kohanim, a marked path that's showing that is designated as being a path that they may walk on. Is this something you've heard of?
Yeah, I've mentioned that a few times here also, that in London they also have paths that are sort of that they have lines that show where a Kohen is allowed to stand, where a Kohen is allowed to be.
That was on the side of the street, but this, they actually said, yes, this must a path only for Kohanim.
I'm not sure. Only it would be only for Kohanim. I think it's a path that's permitted for Kohanim.
Okay, she asked if there was one here, and I said, no, I don't believe there's a specific path, but within our cemetery.
Right. No, we don't have a path that's specific to Kohanim. I've not heard of having a path that's only for Kohanim, except in the temple they used to have a path that was only for Kohanim, so that they wouldn't come in contact with people. But that was when they were on their way to do perform the service in the Beis Hamikdash, where they had to retain a certain element, a certain level of purity which is beyond like what we're discussing, what we're talking about right now. Don't know. Okay, some suggest that the rule of suffix tuma b'rishus harabim is not applied to Kohanim. This is because the principle is only said with regarding to like purity and impurity, but not regarding prohibitions. When it comes to prohibitions, he says, the regular rules of doubt are still in effect. That's a special rule that we apply about whether something is pure or whether something is impure. But we're not talking about purity and impurity. We're talking about is it permitted or something not permitted? Is it going allowed to be or not allowed to be here? So, however, many do say that the principle of suffix tuma b'rishus harabim, this idea of deciding leniently in a public thoroughfare, is applicable to Kohanim, and Kohanim would be permitted to enter such an area. So he's just sort of to a certain extent, he's hedging. He's providing a broad perspective. He's giving you a series of different opinions. He's citing them all. You can take a look at the footnotes on the bottom. It's a scholarly work, and he quotes quite a number of his sources. But the upshot is that there are different opinions about things. But as a rule of thumb, a Kohen can enter into places if it's uncertain that there's a dead body there or not. We assume, if it's a public thoroughfare, leniently, and say that a Kohen is allowed to be present. When we extrapolate, we apply the rule of jurisprudence, that suffix to Mabrusha Rabbim, doubtful sources of impurity in a public thoroughfare, we decide leniently. A grave that's found even near a Jewish home that is unknown if it is Jewish or not is considered to be of the majority of the people in that city. So that's an idea. It's an idea that we don't look at proximity. We look always at majority. So within a given area, we look at a majority. So in a situation like this, when there is a grave, and there are not a ton of differences between Jewish graves and non-Jewish graves, except that we're occasionally somewhat more lenient when it comes to non-Jewish graves. But if you recall, our minhag is to also attribute an impurity that travels through shared shelter to a non-Jewish grave. So, so that means you wouldn't walk over the grave. You wouldn't not only not come in physical contact with the grave, but you couldn't even be under the same roof. If there's a bough of the tree that goes over it, you'd have to separate yourself. But where would this come more into effect is in situations of, where there's an obligation to perform a mitzvah, for example, when we're dealing with other reasons to be lenient. Perhaps we would combine that with the fact that this is a non-Jewish grave to be lenient. But in general, practically speaking, we don't make a lot of distinction between a Jewish and non-Jewish grave, at least as far as a Kohen is concerned. Again, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the class, as we begin, approaching some of these practical applications like airplanes, he tends to be more on the stringent side. I did produce an article here from the OU about how a Kohen should conduct themselves on an airplane. But we're going to take a look at Rabbi Melanchuk, because that's the work that we've been studying until this point, and we'll see what he has to say before perhaps we revise it by looking at this other article that I have here. So he starts now talking about practical applications, situations, circumstances that present challenges for Kohanim. And the first one he discusses are airplanes. A Kohen who's traveling by plane must be aware of the possibility of the transport of a body in the baggage compartment. This is something that does occasionally happen, and therefore, as he says, a Kohen should be on top of his airplane. And he discusses a little bit about what one does. Due to the nature and construction of a plane, tuma, or impurity, will travel throughout the plane, making all inside tameh. Contemporary poskim, contemporary halachic authorities explicitly forbid a Kohen from traveling in a plane that is transporting someone deceased. Let's take a look at footnote 243. An additional issue relates to Kohanim and air travel is the concern of the tuma spreading from a plane containing someone who's deceased into the airport terminal via the jetway that connects the airplane to the terminal. This issue arose in Ben Gurion Airport and was resolved by the Va'ad Hakohanim through a regulation that the sleeve should not be connected to the plane until the coffin, until the aron is removed from the other side of the plane. So in Israel, they actively work to ensure that this is not a problem, where people on the inside of the airport are challenged by access to impurity by bodies that are being flown, that are being brought to Israel for the purposes of burial.
That doesn't have anything to do with the people on the plane. Is that just to protect the people inside the airport?
That this is specifically for the airport. We're going to take a look and see that there were things done to protect the people in the airplane also, but we're going to get there soon.
Okay.
With this issue in mind, a Kohen should take care in making his travel plans, particularly to Eretz Yisrael, particularly to Israel, to avoid a flight that may be transporting someone deceased. If the Kohen is unable to take a flight that will, I would also just, take this all with a grain of salt. If the Kohen is unable to take a flight that will definitely not be transporting the deceased, he should try to ascertain if there is a deceased on his flight, and he may be forced to reschedule or delay his departure. If a person transporting, we'll do that. We'll do that in a second. But he does do a considerable amount of research. We're going to take a look here at the footnotes on page 57. The use of special containers. You see that it's right by the black dot on page 57. The use of special containers designed to minimize the tumor, the impurity of the deceased, is an innovation that's not readily agreed upon. We're going to see from the OU that it probably is. There's greater consent that is a solution than what the author of this work here says. Also, there's no supervision regarding the proper sealing and use of such containers. So let's take a look at here. Note 245. It's the bottom. It's in the English. Roughly half of El Al flights from JFK carry coffins. However, due to special arrangements with the Vad Hakohanim, El Al does not take coffins from Newark, though other airlines might do so. Continental, TWA, and Delta also carry coffins, but with less frequency. Israel typically does not fly coffins. A Kohen may be able to avoid the high frequency of in-flight coffins by traveling through Europe, with the exception of France. I would assume that the EU has rules about how the deceased are transported that France does not abide by, so that if you have a connecting flight in Europe or for any place in the EU, you generally don't have to worry about having someone deceased on your plane. So how do you do this? How do you ensure that your plane is not carrying, carrying the deceased? This can be done by calling cargo 2 to 3 hours before takeoff and asking if there are any human remains on the flight. In some cities, for example, in Toronto, the Chevra Kadishas work together so that one may ask one of them if a coffin is traveling to Eretz Yisrael. That doesn't help us too much as El Al is not flying from Toronto these days. But one can call the airline in advance. One can call the cargo department and find out what the story is about human remains. About 80% of El Al flights, I think, is some number that I saw. It says over here, half of all El Al flights from JFK carry coffins. But a Kohen, really, at least according to the author here, should take special care not to be on the plane with human remains. But I think that would be primarily a concern with regards to flying to Israel. Human remains are not likely to be on the plane under most other circumstances, as you don't find that too many people place a lot of focus on being buried in a particular location. It's a uniquely Jewish, Jewish focus.
People who are not at home in the past, Jewish people who would be flown back.
Often not. Often they're buried locally. Sometimes yes, but often they're buried locally. It's because it could be, remember, yeah. Well, anyways, perhaps we'll come back to it at a different time. But it says over here, but if the plane will definitely travel over a Jewish cemetery, Kohanim should not fly on that flight. We'll come back also to that perhaps in a moment. But we're gonna take a look very, very quickly at this article from the OU. So this is from Rabbi Ari Enkin. He writes, the deceased are routinely flown in baggage compartments on passenger flights for burial into distant places. Since it's considered very worthwhile and meritorious to be buried in the land of Israel, it's especially frequent on El Al flights. 65% of El Al flights have bodies on board. This is problematic for many Kohen that are likely to be on such flights, as the Kohen is forbidden to be in the presence of the deceased. This is because the tuma, the impurity that emanates from the body in the baggage compartment, rises into the passenger cab. They're all considered to be connected, and as a result, there's no sort of interruption. There's no break. They share the same air system. This is because many authorities forbid a Kohen on such flights. Other authorities are lenient and permit a Kohen to fly on a plane that has the deceased in the baggage compartment, especially in extenuating circumstances. So he does quote sources that are lenient and do allow a Kohen to remain on the plane. Who's he quoting? He's quoting the Chuvas Vahanhagos, and Evan Yisrael and several other sources here. So he does quote sources that do allow the Kohen to be on the plane with the deceased, and especially so under extenuating circumstances. It is proper for a Kohen to inquire whether there will be any human remains on this flight, and then make the appropriate decisions accordingly, as we saw earlier as well. A Kohen need not worry that his fly over cemeteries. Again, it's only if you know definitely that's going to go over a specific Jewish cemetery that you have to be concerned. But unless you know that for a fact that that's what's happening, that's not raised or it's not flagged as a problem that requires concern and worry or attention. Nevertheless, El Al Airlines have eliminated the halachic concerns for Kohanim flying on a plane containing human remains. This is because the baggage compartment on El Al airplanes conform to the required dimensions of empty space needed in order to properly separate the baggage. So the baggage compartments from the passenger cabin, so that the tuma does not enter the passenger cabin. In fact, the baggage compartment is also constructed in such a way that it is halachically considered a separate structure from the body of the airplane. So then that El Al has made modifications to their airplanes to minimize the concern as far as Kohanim go. Therefore, there are no concerns that a Kohen may be in violation of being sort of in the same shelter as the deceased. There's also a unique halachically approved method for packing coffins on these flights that prevents the impurity from spreading to other parts of the plane. So if you recall, Rabbi Melechuk says that that does not present a valid halachic solution. Here we see that Rabbi Ari Enkin does rely on them, and this again came from the OU website. Right, what does he say? Just just to see if I can sum up, it appears, however, that even with all the precautions and arrangements mentioned above, Ramosha Feinstein would still forbid a Kohen from flying on any plane containing remains. El Al is prepared to assist their Kohen passengers who subscribe to this ruling and place them on flights that do not contain human remains. Most other contemporary halachic authorities approve of the arrangements mentioned above to allow a Kohen to fly on such flights, and common custom is in accordance with this view.
I'm trying to understand the reason for the heter. It would be that they got their openings. I mean, the two are sealed. The passenger side is sealed from the cargo side. It's just because they're sealed, and there would be no great openings.
So I think they do share some things because the air is pressurized in both compartments and it's probably sharing some connection. Maybe the air is not circulating from one section to the next, but the air is being forced from the single source, which may be enough for it all to be connected.
Okay.
If these holes are of a specific size, if you can minimize the size of the holes, then they're no longer considered to be connected. That's one way of doing it. Another consideration has to do also with the air escapes. If you recall, if you have a enclosed compartment with human remains inside it that does not have some kind of an escape. This was from, I think, maybe last class or the previous class. Then we say that impurity spreads throughout the entire section and then also goes above it. So probably the air outtake was enlarged in these airplanes.
Mhm.
So the air intake is the air where the air is coming from is made smaller. You can have multiple smaller holes, and the holes going out were made larger. That's one possible way that they modified. I don't know for a fact. I'm just sort of speaking hypothetically as to how they did it. They also might have created an additional layers of separation between the baggage compartments and the passenger ones, as well as a possible solution. I don't know all the details. I don't know how this was done, but they had to create ways so that they're halakhically considered distinct and separate sections that are not connected or attached in any way.
But for general, I'm hearing that even for general flight, that according to Rabbi Enken, we don't have a rule, like there's not a concern.
Generally, I wouldn't be super concerned about, like, flying from here to Tucson, for example, or from here
Okay.
to Winnipeg. I would not be super concerned because if you recall, we said before, if you had a grave that was uncertain if it's considered if it's well, that's not a good rationale.
Yeah.
But I would assume that I wouldn't assume automatically that there are human remains on a flight. That would not be my assumption. I would only assume that to be the case for flights going to Israel,
Okay.
and that creating problems that way. I think human remains are generally I think are fairly rarely transported. So I know that Rabbi Melchik actually was in touch with the authorities at O'Hare, and he did get the numbers for the number of bodies that are transported over the course of the year that are not on their way to Israel. And the numbers are remarkably low. It's in one of the footnotes. Take a look at it. It's not a common thing to happen, and I wouldn't worry excessively about it. I wouldn't worry. I wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't take too many precautions. But when it comes to Israel, perhaps I'd make a phone call. I think that is the consensus amongst these two opinions that taking precautions. If you're flying through Europe, you don't have to worry at all. Apparently, um, uh, unless you're going through France. Um, calling ahead. And if you want to remove yourself, some airlines will be very accommodating. If the airlines are not going to be accommodating, you do have halachic authorities that do say that it is. You do have halachic authorities that do allow for the flights, but I would in general. Right now that's easy because LL is like one of the only reliable, but in general, I would recommend flying LL, for the reason that because they are an Israeli and Jewish airline, they do take the halacha into consideration in terms of how they even design their airplanes.
Okay.
All right, we'll conclude here and we'll continue next week.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Not at all, gentlemen. Have a great night. Stay dry.
Okay, good night and thank you.
Good night.
All right, Sean. Send my regards to your mother, and
Yeah, I'll do that.
all right, stay well.